I'm Troy McKenzie. I am the Dean of NYU School of Law, and welcome to another Life of the Law event. That name, Life of the Law, takes its inspiration from a very famous quotation from Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, that the life of the law has not been logic, it has been experience. Holmes went on further to say that a page of history is worth an entire book of syllogisms. Too often, the real, distinctively unique and human stories that constitute the lives of those who have their cases make it all the way to the Supreme Court are lost in the headlines about the court. Today, this evening, we are going to hear some of that human story about a very famous Supreme Court case, the 1990 decision of the court in Employment Division against Smith. Smith, for those of you who have imbibed constitutional law, know that Smith is a landmark ruling on the question of how to interpret the free exercise clause of the First Amendment of the US Constitution. The opinion for the court was written by Justice Antonin Scalia, and in it, Justice Scalia essentially eliminated most of the ability for religious believers to receive exemptions from otherwise generally applicable laws that might burden their ability to practice their religious beliefs. 34 years later, Smith was very controversial at the time it was decided. I was just saying that when I was in college, I read this case for the first time about 4 or 5 years after it was decided, and it was a hotly contested case. Actually hotly contested in a way that cut across ideological lines. It led to Congress's enactment of 2 different pieces of legislation, basically an attempt to overrule the case. One of those was struck down by the Supreme Court, and the other was narrowed by Congress and later enacted. Tonight, we have the unique opportunity to hear the story of one of the plaintiffs in the case, Galen Black, who will be speaking with Joshua Prager. And let me just say a few words about Joshua. For more than 20 years, he has carved a unique path. A former senior writer at the Wall Street Journal, he has written about historical secrets, revealing from behind the curtain all that led to the things that have shaped us today, including, for example, writing about baseball, the hidden scheme that led to Bobby Thompson's shot heard around the world. He has also written about Roe v. Wade. His book, The Family Roe, illuminates the unknown parties and stories behind Roe and offers a public glimpse at the abortion debate in robust social and personal context. That book was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. He has given TED Talks. He has also received fellowships, including the Nieman Fellowship at Harvard, the Ferris at Princeton, and the Fulbright Distinguished Chair at Hebrew University. So we are very, very lucky to have him with us here at NYU. This is now the fourth in the series, and they have been extraordinarily illuminating. I'd like to also close by thanking one of the main supporters who has made this possible, Christopher Buck, who is the founder of Retro Report, a nonprofit news organization that combines documentary journalism with history and civics education to combat misinformation. So I want to thank Christopher for making tonight possible. And now I would like to hand it over to Joshua, who will introduce Galen Black.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dean McKenzie and everyone here at NYU who's made this possible, and also as well, I'd like to thank Chris, who isn't here tonight, but believes in looking back at history and finding sort of the unknown stories that are waiting to be discovered by people so many years later. And I want to also thank a former student of mine, Anna Salvatore, whose idea it was that I reach out to you.
Right.
She knew what I was doing here and suggested your name to me, and I was so glad that she did, because getting to know you as we've spoken has been really fascinating. And you know, Dean Mackenzie mentioned that I'm particularly drawn to people and to stories that are kind of hidden, and you certainly are one of those people. You know, it's been 34 years, we mentioned, since the Supreme Court ruled on this case, and the case is more relevant than ever. But really, no one seems to know anything about you. And you're the person who launched it. The National Constitution Center states in its summary of the case that you are Native American, but you're not Native American. And when the More Perfect podcast recently did an entire episode about the case, it barely mentioned you, and instead focused on your co-plaintiff, Al Smith, as so many people have. So we're excited to hear your story. Thank you very, very much for being here.
Thank you, Josh.
Okay, so to get going, I think it makes sense to start with something having to do with religion, given the nature of your case. So you were born in 1947 in Kansas to an aircraft mechanic and a housewife. You were the youngest of 3 kids, and you grew up in Wichita in a stable middle-class family, as you told me. And you were religious Lutherans. And the kids were baptized and at church every Sunday, and you loved Sunday school. A favorite story was the book of Job, you told me. And when you were 8 or 9, something happened that really was a crisis for you. Your preacher was caught at a motel with a member of the church choir, and your father quit the church.
Right.
And you described this to me, as I say, as one of the real great crises of your life at the time. It opened your eyes to sort of hypocrisy and other things, making sense of the grown-up world. And I wondered if you could talk to us about the impact that this had on you and your religion. And just add one more thing. You told me that you began really as a teenager to search for a new spiritual home, kind of going back and forth between Lutheranism and the Southern Baptist Convention.
Right. I was very disturbed when my dad quit going to church, and I seen the hypocrisy of what was going on. And I knew that Job had went through and withstood all the things that placed upon him. And that when I went to the church the first time, the Native American church, I finally found a place to where I could actually put the action, the faith into action, without the hypocrisy that was involved. But I had searched all my life, you know, and I have a favorite little poem that I searched for myself I could not find. I searched for my God eluded me. I reached out to my fellow man and found all 3. And I had to get out of myself to be able to do that. And that's what had led me to go through a lifetime of alcohol addiction, geographics, the whole 9 yards, 5 wives, and I call myself a recovering husband at times. Then I believe that I was a resident assistant at ADAPT.
You know, we'll get Galen
get
to
to
that
that.
a little bit later.
Okay.
Yeah, when we get to sort of the beginning
Okay.
of your case. But let's first sort of talk about how you got there. And, you know, obviously the case had to do not only with religion, but also what led to the case was your being a counselor, as you say, at a place for recovering alcoholics and drug addicts. And so mental health and sobriety, these were things that you started to think of years earlier. And let's sort of talk about how that came about. So in high school, you told me that you were a person sort of more comfortable at work than in school. But when you joined the Navy Reserves while you were still in high school, and then you headed off when you graduated to Vietnam.
Right.
In 1966, you went on the Intrepid, the USS Intrepid, which is right here. My kids just were there last month at the museum. And the trip did not go well. You had a very difficult time. Your bag was stolen right when you got up there. You had a big fight with the people who caused this. It was a violent fight. You injured them, and you were put in the ship's brig, and it was very scary experience. You told me that you started to experience psychotic mood swings, and you were transferred into a naval hospital in Japan, and then flown to a naval hospital in Oakland. And all of this happened within 4 months when you were honorably discharged right after that. So again, this becomes a very big part of your life and what leads to the case. You're 19 when all of this happens, and the experience left you with PTSD that you now have in check, but that was then very terrifying for you. And I wonder if you could speak to us a bit about the effects that this had, that it had on your mental state, both when you were young and then as the years went by.
The fear as a 19-year-old kid that had been attacked 3 different times, and actually I hadn't had PTSD treatment for about 9 years now. But throughout that whole period of time, I had to turn the light on and even carry a gun or a knife with me just to go to the restroom. That fear was that was all, there were always, that somebody was going to get me no matter what. And which led to that being out of control, not being able to handle my own thoughts without being angry or judgmental or all the negative things that would happen. And up to that point, the PTSD now helps drive me to a better solution than it used to. As I started treatment for that PTSD, I started realizing that what was actually happening is I was able to take the pain away from the memory. And when you can do that, you can see it in a better light, in that it was something that happened and you can't change it. So you need to put it as a memory without putting it into your heart as pain. So I've taken almost all of that pain, which is a constant process, everyday process. Weekly, I go to Wellbriety meetings. That's this. I became a Wellbriety coach.
A Native American treatment program. Wellbriety.
Yes.
A 12-step program.
Yes. And it's in the Indian way, and it was developed by Indian elders in the 1800s when they were trying to sober up each other from this fire water that was stealing their spirits. So as I finally got to the point that I just didn't want to live anymore, I asked God to let me go or show me a better way, because I can't live with all this pain. And within 30 days, I was in a treatment center. And at that treatment center,
You know what, Galen, let's first talk about before you did get there, about some of the things that you went through. To go back, you told me when you returned from being briefly overseas, being in the Navy, that was when you really very quickly started to drink.
yes,
You had a lot of very stressful experiences right from the get-go. In fact, you heard when you were overseas, your high school girlfriend, Frankie, let you know that she was pregnant.
yep,
And when she and her parents picked you up, her father let you know that you were going to marry her.
yes.
And you, on your way home, that is what you did. You stopped on your way back just east of Reno, and you got married. And that marriage did not last. You got divorced. And you took custody of your son, and you worked some odd jobs. And that was really when you began to drink. And first beer, and then what you called Colorado Kool-Aids, which you told me were Coors, Pepsi, and bourbon.
Yeah.
And your struggle then with alcohol deepened, and all through the 1970s, and through a second marriage and different religious phases. You were a Seventh-day Adventist for a time, and then a Jehovah's Witness. All of these different experiences, you really were adrift. And then to get what you just mentioned, to get to what you just mentioned in 1981, after the birth of a third child, you hit proverbial rock bottom. You attempted suicide at the wheel of your car. And then you checked into a treatment center for 30 days. And that really was an enormous turning point in your life.
Yes, it was.
And you, a year later, in February of 1982, you were really sober, finally sober at the age of 34. And you were helped over the coming months by these sort of almost daily, Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. Can you tell us about this, what you were speaking about earlier, the sobriety, how you found it, and really what it did for you?
I had at the treatment center, I had one of those out of control moments where I was just yelling and screaming and cussing, and because it was all boiling to a point. Everybody was talking about feelings and different things, and every time they said something about it, it hurt. It just literally got to the end. So I blew up. I went out to the street corner. I said, well, I've blown it this time. This is the last time, I bet. Because it had happened before. I tried to quit, couldn't quit. Tried to please my boss, my wife, and my family, and it never worked. So at that point, I walked out to the corner. I said, what do I do now? And a voice didn't say to me, but it was inside me that you're responsible for what you just did. You need to go back and apologize to these people. I had never in my life thought about a thought like that before. So I went back in and apologized. And my counselor at that point said, you finally took step one, realizing how unmanageable you are. And from that point on, I got back to Roseburg. They had 3 treatment centers and 3 meetings a day. And I did the 90 days and 90 meetings, and that kept going for quite a while. I became active. People didn't like it real well when I poured coffee because I'd pour it on them too. And I got still shaking. I was just a nervous wreck. But as recovery progressed, and I started getting into these AA meetings and starting to really listen to what the people were saying. Because I had went 11 years before when I first started going to AA. And then go to the bar after a meeting and thank God I wasn't that sick. So at that point, 4 months after I had come out of the treatment center, my house burnt down. And at that point, my first thought was, I don't want to go to the bar. I want to go to my sponsor's house, which I ended up doing. So I went to my sponsor's house, and he guided me through it and got me to some meetings, and I started feeling better, and I started getting back into the groove of being in the middle of the herd in AA is the best place to be. Then you have surrounded yourself with positive people.
So I'll stop you right there.
Okay.
It was remarkable that you were able at that point to sort of stop this cycle. You just had this tragedy, your house burns down, and yet, as you say, you went to your AA sponsor, and this really impressed him. And it leads to you soon after, in 1982, beginning to work at a nearby sobriety program called ADAPT first as an assistant and then as a junior counselor. You're earning $1,000 a month in salary and benefits, and you also have a good job. You're a mechanic like your father, and really your life for the first time in decades is stable. You're with your wife and kids,
Right.
and making a go of it. Tell us what the work, beginning to work as a counselor at ADAPT was like for you.
They had come to me after my house burnt down and asked me if I wanted to be helpful and be a resident assistant at a brand new, what they call community intensive residential treatment, which was one of 3 put out in the state so that they could serve the minorities, as they called it at that point in time. And so I went on and as a resident assistant, I would take people to meetings. I would take them out to the sweat lodge where I first met Al Smith. He provided a Native American sweat lodge for client treatment through the recovery program.
Why don't you tell us what a sweat lodge is?
That's sweat lodge is a real complex but simple thing. You have a pit with fire, stones, and you lay them all out in certain ways. And then you have a little altar to put your prayer things on, and then you have a lodge which has one door in it. And you go into the lodge, then they bring the stones in, and the leader of the ceremony will start the prayer songs as he puts the water on the stones. And as when I first felt that, my heart was going to blow up. I couldn't breathe. I was going to sweat till I dehydrated. I was thinking all these crazy thoughts. And I realized that these are distractions. These are distractions. And if I could put them to the side, then I could really understand and be a part of that ceremony. So I practiced that for quite a while and became involved with the powwows and the drumming and Title IV presentations, the Sundance, and I'd been doing that for a while. And then Al told me, he said, why don't you go to this church meeting tonight?
You know, let me first tell people a little bit about Al.
Get
So
ready.
you mentioned that Al Smith was really the one who introduced you here. He introduced you to these Native American rituals and ceremonies.
Okay.
And we could see a photograph of him here. Here he is. He was 63 years old, a lot older than you, a former alcoholic who is now an outpatient counselor. He'd been born into an Indian tribe in Oregon, but he had been taken, like so many young Native Americans, taken from his family's home at the age of 7, his grandparents' home, and put into a Catholic boarding school. He was an alcoholic by the time he was finishing high school. He became sober in his late 30s and then devoted himself thereafter to doing what he was doing with you, which was really helping Native people overcome drug and alcohol addictions, in part through what you found so incredibly moving, a sweat lodge that he ran, this sort of Native ritual involving prayer and purification. You started to assist him. And so you were telling us a little bit about, why you found these rituals so meaningful to you. They were clarifying for you. And you just then mentioned the Native American church. So I'll just sort of step back and say a bit about that, and then we'll ask you about it. So Al then mentioned to you this church. It's an indigenous religion
Right.
that he practiced. And at the heart of the ceremonies is really what gets to the heart of the case that you get involved in, is peyote, which is an hallucinogenic cactus that the church used as a sacrament, much like wine is used as a sacrament in the Catholic Church. And he told you about a meeting that was coming up on September 10th, 1983.
Right.
He was sick, he didn't go. You went by yourself. And you met there a man named Stanley Smart, who was the president of the local chapter. And he told you about peyote and that it was used by the church in recovery too, not as a drug, but really as a medicine. And when they then passed around the peyote first as sort of a powder that you mix with tea, you let it go by. The second time it went around in these little pieces for people to chew. And you did chew a small piece of it, about the size of a pencil eraser, you said. Tell us a little bit about the effects that the ceremony had on you in general. I know it was a transformative experience for you. And then also the physical effects that the peyote had on you.
At that point in time, I had talked to Stanley, the roadman, for about an hour and a half. I helped him do the wood before that meeting. And he told me, he said, this is for honored guests, people that really want to sober up and really want to help their brothers and sisters. And at that point, I, inside myself, gave myself permission to go on and partake, so that in my training, multicultural training, I would be able to help the native people that came from that way of life. There was over 400 or 4,000 Navajo people that had recovered and was documented by going to this spiritual church. It was all about spiritual recovery, as AA and NA is also. And the spiritual recovery is individual. So when I went in to that church, there were 7 other counselors plus the director that was in that meeting with us. And it was all about the helping each other be strong enough to help others. And by that medicine, when I took that medicine, it kind of took all this crazy thoughts and distractions away. It kind of focused my mind. And I felt a real camaraderie with everything in that circle, because I knew everybody was becoming focused on that spirituality.
We're looking at a picture of you here holding a bunch of sage, I think, right?
That was river sage. We use that in the sweat lodge a lot.
Yeah, yeah.
And,
So, you know, you were eager to tell people about how special this experience was for you. And so you told a coworker at ADAPT that you had had this beautiful experience at the ceremony, and you mentioned the peyote. And the woman you mentioned this to told your boss, a fellow named John Gardine, who immediately suspended you. And ADAPT then gave you 3 choices: quit, get fired, or get treatment. And you had agreed when you started to work there to not, while you were employed at ADAPT, to not use any drugs or alcohol.
right.
But as you told me, they said nothing about sacrament in a church.
Correct.
That was where your mind went. And weeks later, on October 3rd, 1983, you told your boss that there was a 4th option he'd neglected to mention, which was you're taking him to court.
Right.
And so before we get to the suit, let's talk about what happened when you filed it, because I find this very interesting. You went through a lot very quickly. ADAPT stopped your benefits. You went on food stamps. You lost several friends, and your wife kicked you out, angry, as she said, that you had used peyote, that you were sort of back to your, ways with drugs and alcohol.
Yeah.
You then moved into a little plywood shack right beside a sweat lodge that was nearby. It would have been obviously easier for you to let the suit go, given all of these things that you were experiencing, but you proceeded. And I want to know, what was it inside of you that was so upset about what you experienced and so driven to change the law?
I had promised myself when I went to that meeting, the prayer that I had was that I would be able to stand up and talk about what I believed in without worrying about other people's opinions, which really was none of my business, what they felt like, because it was between me and the Creator. my spiritual development. So at that point, I decided that I could not be untrue to myself, that I had to follow through, no matter what. And that's where Job really came into my life in reality, and in the fact that many things were happening. My family was taken apart. You know, I was put in a situation where I only had choice of evils. Most of the jobs that I had applied for said that I wouldn't last very long because you're a political football. And as a political football, I could expect, you know, nothing from the courts because I was a white guy. And
Let's hold off on that,
Okay.
because that is a very important part of this, the
Yes,
fact
it
that you
is.
were a white guy. And given what was at the heart of your case was peyote and a Native American ritual.
Right.
But before you became a political football, you needed to file suit. And you needed a lawyer to do so.
yeah,
And you told me, you know, you couldn't afford the lawyers you found in the yellow pages. And so you turned to legal aid. You had seen their posters at a laundromat and at the food stamps office.
right.
And a lawyer named David Morrison took your case. You told David, and this is interesting to me that you already had sort of given this thought, that you wanted to sue on the grounds that ORS 430, which was Oregon's statutes on mental health and alcohol and drug programs, should have allowed for peyote use on therapeutic grounds. You felt that should be allowed. But David said he would only argue the case on the grounds that ADAPT had violated your constitutional right to freely exercise your religion.
Right.
And so you agreed, and he filed suit, Black v. Employment Division. So can you talk to us a little bit about first these two sort of legal approaches, the one you had in your mind and then the one that ends up becoming, you know, the grounds for the case that we all know?
From the first time I talked with David, when I went over and asked if legal aid could help me, he told me no. He told me no. So I told him, and he said, and I told him, said, they told me I would not find a lawyer in Oregon that would stand up for a man's rights like that. So from that point on, David, you know, he said, well, he got kind of upset with what I told him. And he said, well, I'll take it, but it'll be on a freedom of religion basis. I had tried to get him to understand that my pathway through the CERT and the Indian Health Service, Commission on the Indian Services, they all had it in their paperwork. And when I had talked to Stanley, I had no idea that I was going to be fired, none. I thought I was, as a counselor, training in multicultural aspects of treatment, which Al actually, after he sobered up, after the 1978 Freedom of Religion Act, he was in a program where he went around to the states and helped set up this Indian Health Service and commissions on these ceremonies that Congress had said they were sui generis. They had been going on for 100 years. So at that point, I totally believed that through all this legal, I thought it was always legal. I wouldn't have been at an Indian treatment center involved in Indian treatment had I thought I would get fired.
So
You know?
it was a treatment center that had a few Native American clients, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And through the CERT thing, we had to provide treatment for the Native American people and
Among the others, yeah.
any of the other minorities. So Al did that through the Sweat Lodge, and it was always just spiritual, whatever you believed in. do it spiritually, put it into action. And at that, at that juncture, I'm kind of lost.
Okay. No, you mentioned Al.
I got so
We'll
much
move on
in
to
my mind.
it's a lot to think, and you're doing great. One of the interesting things is obviously Al was Native American, and you were not. You both found meaning in this church. But when you first reached out in those first few months for legal help to various organizations, they all said no.
Correct.
These included the Oregon Commission on Indian Services, the Civil Rights Division of the Oregon Bureau of Labor and Industries, the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and the Native American Church, who wrote to the president, Emerson Jackson, who never responded. There was a feeling, which I guess I understand, that the cause needed a Native plaintiff. But after your friend Al Smith then also chewed peyote at a meeting of the Native American Church a few months after you did in March 1984, he also got fired. He filed suit. Then they all sort of got aboard. The Native American Rights Fund and the Indian Health Service got involved, and others as well. So I want to ask you, what are your thoughts about this, about race, the fact that the cause would only rally around a Native American plaintiff?
Well, most of the Native American people didn't want me to be the forefront in that fight for religious freedom. They wanted an Indian person to do that. So, in a sense, I got kicked to the curb with what I was trying to bring out, the legal part that was, I still believe, legal in Oregon through the Mental Health Division. And in chapter 430 of that, it talks about treatment for the indigenous population, including ceremonies that were incomprehensible to mainstream, that they had to allow that. And it's like the genocide, the assimilation after effects, that only a certain people can go to this church, for spiritual guidance and spiritual life.
So the case then begins its sort of ascent up the judicial ladder. It goes little by little through a series of appeals. And it's two cases, yours and Al's, from the Oregon Circuit Court to the Oregon Court of Appeals to the Oregon Supreme Court to the Supreme Court of the United States, which in 1987 grants cert. They said that they'll hear the case, and they consolidated your two cases into one, and your name is dropped. The case is now Employment Division, Department of Human Resources of Oregon v. Smith. And then the Supreme Court returns the case to the Oregon Supreme Court to clarify what they said, the status of peyote as a matter of Oregon law. The Oregon Supreme Court immediately punts the case right back to the Supreme Court, asking it to decide whether the First Amendment protected the use of peyote.
Right.
And the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in your case a second time on November 6, 1989. So 6 years after you had begun this ball rolling. What was it like for you at this point? You were not there at the oral arguments. We can talk why. You had a lot going on, difficult things in your family.
Yeah.
What was it like, though, for you to know that your case had reached the highest court in the land?
I was really excited. I thought at first that finally they're going to learn something here about what's going on. And when I returned that case, it was totally, I didn't feel like they had done their homework. In the Native American exemptions from 1978, Freedom of Religion Act hadn't got around to the states, it seemed. That it's on paper, but they're not practicing it.
Why weren't you there?
I was having a lot of personal problems. I had, through the divorce, my wife had been with a druggie and he had beat one of my kids, and then she ran off to Washington. And
Wow.
about 6 weeks later, when I finally got in touch with my kids, she asked me if I could take the kids down to her mom's in California. I said, oh, heck yeah, please. Yeah. I went and got the kids, brought them home to Eugene, Oregon, and set myself up as a single father, taking care of my children. And I couldn't go to New York because I didn't have any way or anybody that would take care of my kids while I was gone. But I wanted to go to New York and talk to them myself. And I know that wouldn't have been available, but
Did your family know that you were the plaintiff of a case, the co-plaintiff of a case that was in the Supreme Court?
did my family know? My family knew, and actually, from what my ex-wife had told the kids, they didn't want to be around me very much. And anyway, when I got my kids back, we had a lawyer that allowed her 1 year of recovery before she could get the kids back. And then we traded back and forth a year at a time so that we both could have our children and raise our children in our way, you know. And that it was just really super hard. Like I said earlier, like a choice of evils. I didn't have a way to make enough money to live comfortably. We had to be on food stamps and a welfare check for a long time, which really bugged me. And people said I was a political football, so it was hard to find a job other than a part-time rental yard mechanic. And that didn't pay enough hardly to do anything. And then the state would take dollar for dollar away, whatever you earned. So it was really a hard-pressed time in all of our lives. But now,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
now my children all are looking at this as this is finally an answer to a prayer of 34 years, 40 years long. Almost every day I would ask that I would be able to tell the whole story from my side of it. And today, it's just beautiful that Creator has worked in this way, that we're all here together to hear the other side of the story, thanks to Josh.
Well, we're honored that you're here, and we're not yet finished, so let's keep going. You know, while you were dealing with all of these very difficult things back home in Oregon, off in the Supreme Court of the United States, they were getting ready for oral arguments. And again, you have made clear your belief that this case should have centered on the legal rights of people in Oregon receiving mental health services, not on religious freedom. But regarding religion, you did say something that you were very clear to me about. You wish, you told me, that federal law had allowed you to use the Native American church to rehabilitate people interested in that church.
Right.
And you wanted to basically spread its teachings. And I want to play for you 2 snippets of the arguments that touch on something related, something that I know is important to you. The idea that the law might not respect a minority faith as much as it would, say, Christianity.
Right.
And first, we're going to hear Justice Stevens asking the lawyer representing Oregon why wine is okay as a sacrament, but peyote is not.
Right.
Increasing frequency for other drugs and other religions.
Your flat rule position would permit a state to outlaw totally the use of alcohol, including wine in religious ceremonies.
That's a different question.
Why is that different?
The issue of sacramental wine is different because at least at the present, it is not a Schedule I substance.
But
the
the
color-
state certainly could prohibit the consumption of alcohol within its borders, or at least the sale or use of alcohol.
But there might be a religious accommodation argument of an entirely different order than is presented here.
You mean it's just a better-known religion?
No, has nothing to do, it is religion indifferent.
And now, I like that, better no religion. Now we're going to hear a snippet from your lawyer, Craig Dorsey, who continued Justice Stevenson's thought regarding wine and peyote.
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court, I'm compelled as an initial matter to address the subject raised by Justice Stevens relating to the use of alcohol, which I think raises one of the primary problems with this case as it comes before the court. I think if you looked at this situation and Indian people were in charge of the United States right now or in charge of government, and you look at the devastating impact that alcohol has had on Indian people and Indian tribes through the history of the United States, you might find that alcohol was a Schedule I substance and peyote was not listed at all.
Right.
And we're getting here to the heart of an ethnocentric view, I think, of what constitutes religion in the United States. And I think that needs to be looked at very hard before determining what is a dangerous substance and what is not.
So I wanted to ask you about this, what they're talking about. Your thought about what, as the lawyer stated just now, that what is legal and what is not legal depends in part, in this case, on which religion is at issue. What do you think about that?
Well, hypocritical. Some of them old feelings come rising back up to the top, and it shouldn't be that way. And that just further emboldened myself to stay with my original prayer, to stand up and talk about it, and talk about not only my belief, but the benefits that it has done for me in my life, so that, are we to Will Bridie yet?
We'll get there in a minute, but you can say it. Yeah. No, you're wearing the pin.
But
It's
it kept
important.
me learning more and more and more. It put me on a positive path. And then I started getting some problems with the PTSD, and I ended up on the Social Security early in life. Like right now, I kind of get in short little snippets. It's like this train station in Chicago that I went to at boot camp. There was a roundhouse and there was trains coming and going all the time and moving back and forth. That's how my mind worked at that point in time. And it was really hard to keep it slowed down. And if I didn't do anything, it would get right back going again. So I had to stay in recovery. So throughout that, I worked at one time with Siletz Tribal, with the people out firefighting with their group of Native people that had come out of prison. And I went into OSP, Oregon State Prison, with Al, and we brought powwow and drums in there and helped the people, giving hope to the people, not, cutting them off like I had been.
Galen, let's pause there and talk about the actual ruling itself. So a few months after the oral arguments on April 17th, 1990, the Supreme Court rules against you and Al, 6-3.
Right.
Justice Scalia, he wrote the majority opinion, which stated that the constitutional right to free exercise of religion does not allow people in the course of a religious ceremony like the one you were part of to engage in an illegal act. And if a person does violate the law, even in the name of religion, They're not entitled to unemployment benefits. And so you told me an interesting thing when I asked what your reaction to the ruling was. Your mind went to Al Smith. So why don't you tell us about that? Your fellow co-plaintiff. You were thinking about, as you mentioned to me, that he was not surprised by the ruling.
Oh. Yeah, when it first came,
That's right.
Al said he wasn't surprised because he had been treated this way throughout his life as an Indian person, and that he didn't expect too much more at that point. And I felt like, kind of the same thing, Al had told me, he said, it's happening to me, it's going to happen to you too. And I just couldn't believe that, but it actually happened. So at that point, that ruling is like a kick in the butt for me because I'm the one that brought the case up. And Al, when he went to church, he went to pray about what they were doing to me. And then he was terminated for going and taking the sacrament. So I felt like that because I wasn't protected. I still am not to go into the church that I chose to go to. Legally, I can't go in and use the peyote. I can't go.
Yeah, that's
and
something
do
fascinating.
that.
We'll get to that right now, which
Okay.
is really very interesting and sort of sad and ironic given this whole story.
Right.
So in recent years, the Supreme Court has recognized all sorts of religious exemptions. For example, allowing groups of people to gather despite COVID restrictions. And there is now speculation that conservative members of the Supreme Court would like perhaps to overturn Justice Scalia's ruling in Smith. But no matter what happens in the future with your case, Congress, as Dean McKenzie mentioned, granted you sort of a partial victory in 1994 when it passed an amendment to the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. And that 1978 act had protected the rights of Native Americans to practice their religion, and the 1994 amendment to it made peyote use by Native Americans lawful for, quote, bona fide traditional ceremonial purposes. So this amendment thus granted to Al Smith, who was Native American, the legal right to use peyote
Right.
at the church, but not to you. And what are your thoughts about this?
At first, I came to the church as an honored guest because I was working with other people and trying to help them sober up. And that why the court didn't encompass me into that ruling by saying Native Americans and honored guests is like another part of that genocide or assimilation where they don't allow you to grow. They keep you held down, and that's what they were doing with the church in this case. What we were doing, helping others recover, and the work that Al had done, and the work that I was doing, going out with the Native people and staying with the Native people a lot because they were the ones that picked me up after the meeting. 30 days later, I was without friends, without a job, and no money, no nothing, on my side, except the Native people. They gave me a place to stay. They got food for me and things that I needed. They took me to meetings when I needed to go. They really helped me out. And they mentioned that they were proud that I had stood up, to fight the courts over this. And to me, it was almost absurd to have it last very long. But yet here it is, you know, that I finally get to talk about my side of the story, the thing that actually started Smith versus unemployment, and then the U.S. Supreme Court versus peyote. So at that point, you know, they asked, one of the court asked if, why can't these people start a marijuana church, and why can't these people start a heroin church? In 1978, the Freedom of Religion Act said sui generis, which meant the ceremonies had to be going for 100 years. You can't just start something up. They had to be in place. And those were the ceremonies that I believed brought out the legality of the church, and the church inviting people in, you know, to help them to help them be a part of the church. And,
Well, to finish up on a happy note, you're doing very well nowadays. When I called you, I reached out to you. You made that clear. You're 76 years old. You've got grandkids and a girlfriend. You collect Social Security and a monthly stipend from the VA, money that has given you really security. You bought a Jeep and you have a little house in Oregon. You're sober, most importantly. You attend these weekly meetings of Wellbriety, which you mentioned to us, this Native American 12-step program. And you continue to practice Native American rituals, smudging every day beside the Pacific Ocean, and also using your very own sweat lodge. I just wanted to ask you if there's anything else you want us to know about you and your journey to this day, and maybe any thought you wish to leave us with.
my thought, I had mentioned it to you in the courtyard earlier, that what I had learned were 4 basic things, and that was to have faith in the Creator and be honest, be kind, and share that. And when we look at the Chanupa, which it took me about 3 years after a vision quest before I was able to carry a Chanupa to pray with the people and for the people.
What is a Chanupa?
A Chanupa is a sacred pipe. So the stone of the pipe is the faith we have in the Creator. The honesty is like the tree, the stem of that pipe. Honesty, it may bend in the wind a little bit, but it always stands back up. Kindness is like the grasses and the medicines that cover Mother Earth, and the things that we use, sage, cedar, peyote, all those medicines. And the kindness that covers Mother Earth. And then when we put all that together, we're in communication with the Creator as we smoke that pipe with the sacred tobacco, the Chanupa. Chinchaisha is the inner bark of a willow tree, and that's what is used in the sacred pipe. So if I just can relay 4 things: be faithful, be honest, be kind, and share that in your life.
Well, you've now shared that with all of us, so thank you very, very much.
Thank you all. Thank you all.